I'm very happy to be speaking to Piet Croucamp this morning. Piet is at the Northwest University at the Department of Politics, and he's a well-known figure, especially in Afrikaans communities and on Afrikaans radio. Piet, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Piet, a while ago, you mentioned something on radio, and that comment stuck with me. It really sort of has not left me. And you said something about the church's role or responsibility, or in church language, let's call it calling, when it comes to poverty and poverty alleviation. Won't you say something more about that, please?
I think the original reason why I thought about it was more functional, in the sense that the church has an enormous logistical network. Just in my area, there are several churches, which means the reach of the church, if it's necessary to do something that requires logistics, the church has an enormous reach. So I think from a functional perspective, I think the church could reach areas in society which sometimes even the state can't reach, and where NGOs might find difficulty to reach. And I think the church has the logistical network. So I think that was the one aspect. The other thing is, of course, I said that more or less in the middle of COVID, I think. And at the time, the need for institutional presence, either be the state or the church or NGOs or even just families, just that presence of somebody that can alleviate or empathize to some extent with the depression conditions for a whole lot of people in South Africa. I always think that was important, and the church, of course, could fulfill that role. Like I think you mentioned earlier when we just started talking, was that there were various ways and means to reach out to people which you physically couldn't. My church is just here, I think 150 meters from me. I could hear the church bells ring every day. I have a presence. The dominee doesn't live far from here. So, and if I walk up to the coffee shop to have a cup of coffee, I walk past the dominee busy cleaning the yard of the church because the workers couldn't come in. So there was this presence all the time of the church. And I just thought that presence could translate in some other way to being involved with poverty. And I think poverty was the real big thing of COVID. I can't remember anything over the last 30 years that brought poverty so close to people's lives, daily lives, as COVID has done. And yes, so I think from a functional perspective, I thought about the church as an institutional setting that might be a presence in people's lives under very, very difficult circumstances.
While you're talking about the network and the institutional, setting, the presence, it is quite incredible to think that in every town, in every city, in every village, in every suburb, there are several churches who are present. And I'm wondering, just as a sort of rhetorical question, I'm wondering if we could almost get a bird's eye view of what churches have been doing in this time in terms of poverty alleviation. I wonder what we would see. And you and I won't have the answers because, I know that, for example, here in our area, our soup kitchen, which ran before COVID started, we've gone up from about 45 people coming for a meal on a Monday morning to this past Monday, we had 106 people. So that says something. But what I want to ask you about is more in the sort of abstract or philosophical space. Do you think that the church has a role to play, or church leaders for that matter? If you think about the NG Kerk, for example, do you think that church leaders have a contribution to make when it comes to thinking about, because in my mind, thinking precedes all our actions, right? So we can go into, in this time, we had to go into emergency alleviation mode, and that is fine. But do you think that church leaders have a role to play in thinking about the systemic sort of problems of things like poverty and injustice, those things? What do you think about that?
Look, thinking is incredibly important, but thinking is meaningless, worthless, if there's not an institutional architecture to, in some other way, allow the idea to proliferate and to penetrate society and to be present in society. And the church, you need the church. The dominee needs the church for that encroaching presence on society. And we must also not be naive about what the church can do in many ways. The churches are relatively poor. There are rich churches, but by and large, churches in South Africa are relatively poor. It's not as if the church can spend enormous amounts of money on society. They need that goodwill to come from somewhere else. They need that investment that they would like to make in society to come from somewhere else. And to make that, to gain that resources, the church must establish another network, the one that goes into society, into people that need their poverty situation to be addressed, but also those that have must in some other way become part of this institutional architecture through which the church then channel goodwill and good ideas and all the other things that the church could possibly do. They must channel it through back to all other sectors and spheres of society. The church have two problems. The one is, like I mentioned, it is relatively poor. The second thing is we have a massive secularization over the last 2 to 3 decades in South Africa, which means, as I said, the church are just up here, up the hill, 100 meters from me. If I go past Sundays, then, I'm not religious, but for me, it's heartbreaking to see 10, 15 cars standing on a Sunday morning in the church. And I know that that institution and the capacity of that institution to do good is being corroded and eroded by the fact that there is almost no presence. There's no people there, very few, and it's always the same people going there. And those people might have resources, but they have limited resources, because what you need is a broad base of resources really to address the massive problems that we have in society, of which the church can just, in some other way, you just funnel the goodwill back into the less, the marginalized parts of society. But for me, it's one of the tragedies, and that the church, I think, is in some other way secularized, but that part of that is what is disappearing as the constructive role that he has played in some ways in society, and that it could play in society. And what we have left is we have alternative structures, organizational structures. We have the state, for instance. We have NGOs, we have business sectors, we have business chambers, etc. But they don't play the role of giving. They tend to play the role of facilitating or creaming off profits and distribute it into the most effective and efficient way. Whereas I think part of the message, part of the goodwill, part of the resources that flow to the marginalized part of society must come with a message of compassion, of affection, of love, of goodwill. I just think there's a dearth in South African society of empathy, of compassion. And I think the state could play an enormous role there if the surpluses that we could generate somewhere else and that we distribute into society comes with just more than it's more than just a plate of food. It comes with not necessarily, and I'm reluctant to say that the church must necessarily pass on a message, because I think it's quite possible to exploit the situation and say, well, you must remember, you must convert, you must think like I do, or you must be careful for what can happen to you if you don't buy into the narrative of the church. If it comes with all those subliminal messages that I think can be very destructive, it'll be very harmful. I just think compassion and empathy and love, and the fact that there's somebody present during very, very difficult times, I think that's much more important. Sometimes the church, and I understand that the context of religion and how it is important that people should buy into the message. But sometimes the church must suspend its own interests I think for the purpose of what God's interest would have been, or what Jesus' interest would have been. And that is that just be present, just express compassion and hope and love and the things that people also need, apart from the material needs that they might have.
While you are mentioning those words, compassion and kindness and love, and you are sort of almost framing it in terms of presence, I cannot help but think of the current Pope. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons for his, well, seemingly his popularity, because that's the language that he is speaking. He's broken down so many of the perceived boundaries between, say, clergy and laity, and just communities. That is the language. That is I think, where the church often falls short. In terms of both presence and embodying those things. Now, of course, I mean, my mind is going to, but how in this time do we embody that presence? But obviously, we're all trying in our own ways. Peter, I want to ask you about this, and we've agreed that this won't be a very long chat. And for the sake of impact and just being clear, I want to ask you about this. In terms of those things that you've mentioned, the network the church has, the institutional presence, the institutional architecture, how, if you were to, I mean, I'm asking you this, if you were to give the church advice in terms of how to maximize its impact and how that would work or look practically, what would that advice be? And then please just break it down into denominations or groupings of churches. And now I'm talking is the established churches. I'm not now talking the Anglicans and the Methodists and the Roman Catholic Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, the Hervormde Kerk, the Gereformeerde Kerk. If we could, I mean, and there are structures in place, this SARK, the South African Council of Churches, is there. So if we talk broadly in terms of denominations or ecumenically speaking, and then congregations, local congregations, and then individuals, because I am the church too. The members who make up the church, they are also the church. How would you talk? How would you think about and recommend almost a maximization of impact?
I would start with I think right at the heart of the concept of Christianity is the idea of neighborly love, or like they call it in Afrikaans, naaste liefde. I think we will have to rethink that concept, given the complex structure that you referred to. Neighborly love has a history thousands of years ago, where it was very important to have internal cohesion, because the enemy on the outside was big and was strong and destructive and had an encroaching presence. So neighborly love meant that we must in some other way form or ferment a type of consensus. We cannot afford, don't steal somebody's cattle, don't look at his wife, don't do the things that make the internal cohesion, that under strain, because we cannot afford it. So neighborly love or naaste liefde was really an inside type of narrative. How do we remain together? I think we have to rethink about neighborly love or naaste liefde in the sense that it must, and compassion, the word compassion, the Buddhist word compassion makes provision for that it goes across boundaries. There's no natural, institutional, intellectual, mental, psychological boundaries in the idea of compassion. Because once you break down that barrier to broader participation, then you get what I've seen recently of a group of Muslim people that, for instance, would travel through the countryside in the Karoo, and they will transport food for animals, and they will assist farmers during drought. That it doesn't matter the fact that they are Muslim and that the farmers probably mostly Christian. The deed goes beyond the boundaries of neighborly love. I just think that if the church can do itself a favor, not the church, but I think if the children of God, the people that believe in God, the people that love God, if they can just think, what was the original meaning of neighborly love, and what would God today expect us? How would he want us to, or he or she want us to define neighborly love today? We cannot afford for neighborly love to include my neighbor only, or the people that are closest to me, or people that think like me, or people that share my history with me. We simply can't afford it. And I think that's part of the mental rethink. I think that God-fearing people have to have, and that is, we have to think, revisit the idea of what it means to be a naaste. The naaste should go to the next, or to every human being, instead of somebody that's just closest to me. Closest historically meant somebody that I have something in common with, that I share an enemy with, that I might need under particular circumstances, that sit at my table, that live close to me. That was what a naaste was. And I can understand the history of it in the Bible, but today we simply can't. And I think that the church, and I'm dead sure that God never intended your naaste or your neighborly love to reach only to the people that you are known with, that you are familiar with. I always thought that it will reach to the next human being, and that people have distorted that idea a little bit for practical reasons. It made sense at the time, because that's how people survived. It was very, very difficult circumstances to survive. You needed your neighbor to survive. Well, today we need each other to survive, not only our neighbors.
Yeah. While you're talking, and I think, in my mind, I went to sort of Old Testament ideas of and those kinds of communities that were so reliant on each other. I read yesterday, and I'm really bad with numbers and remembering figures and numbers, but I read somewhere yesterday in the new book of Jonathan Sachs called Morality. He says there that there are more mentions of the stranger and extending hospitality and love and kindness to the stranger in the Old Testament than we think. And I think the number that he quoted in that book was 37 times. That's not, this the end of twee. I mean, it's not a sort of a side or optional tiny reference. 37 is substantial. So it's both Old and New Testament in terms of that thinking that...
I think he's very right. And it's a pity that even I think who studied the Bible extensively throughout my life, that missed sometimes that message that even the stranger, now that you mention it, I can recall it, that the word stranger and the aura of the stranger being present, and how you should deal with the stranger. And I can't recall anywhere in the Bible where it specifically said that the stranger should be avoided and that he should be kept away from your door. But that's sometimes a message that we miss in the Bible. I think there are lots of messages that we miss in the Bible, but that's one of the things, you're very right, that we sometimes miss. What exactly? Because remember, the stranger is not your neighbor. The stranger is not your naaste. That's somebody else.
Absolutely, absolutely. Piet, I almost want to, I don't want to end this conversation too quickly, but you have given me and you've given us a lot to work with. I'm cautious now to say think about, because I realize that part of the sort of constant invitation of God is to move out of this and even out of this, into service, into deeds, into presence, as you so wonderfully pointed out.
Just be careful, Rudy. Just be careful not to make God so one-dimensional. The idea of a God is a rational idea. Compassion has a rational architecture. The idea of reaching out to people requires a very functional way of thinking. You have to apply your mind. You have to muster resources. You must look at the deficits and the liabilities and the credits and what you have. God is not just something good. Let's just do something good. It's a life that has to be lived. A life that has to be lived. That has to be distribute the greater good to the largest number of people, if not to everybody. And for that, you need to have an accountant and a scientist. And God is not some esoteric figure that this Mother Teresa-like figure. I think Mother Teresa has done us enormous harm in the sense that it created the idea that you can receive from those who have, and they're very nice if they do it, and you distribute to the poor. No, it's complicated. It falls into the rhythm of life. We have to proactively do something. It's not going to happen by itself. People will not be good just because you want them to be good. You have to implement a system that reward people for being good, and that has a penalty for being nasty to other people. That's how good systems work. And I think the system of God is exactly the same. People need to be rewarded for doing something good. I'm not saying they should be rewarded materially, but they should get recognition, and they should, in ways and means, make it purposeful for them to recontribute or contribute again. It's a very practical thing. Just remember that the God that has designed this complicated universe will not work with us in baby steps and as if we are babies. The rhythm of the cosmos is the rhythm of human beings, and goodwill will be conceived in the rhythm of the cosmos, not in the naive baby steps that we sometimes think is necessary in our interaction with each other.
Piet, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you. May we talk again. May we speak again. May we encounter each other again somewhere. And thank you for your time. And thank you for your message. And thank you for this picture of the rhythm of life and the rhythm of being. I mean, I know that in my thinking, and I don't want to, obviously, nobody can be blamed, but in my thinking, I often go to that place where I'm actually ending up with a very limited image of God. And you've just reminded me that God is so much bigger than any of my ideas, etc.
It was a great privilege, and thank you very much. And I hope we see each other again soon.
Thank you. Go well, Piet. Baie dankie.
Thank you.